Is episode 5, where we discuss everything food, mood, microbiome, and your memory with my guest, Dr. Amy Loughman. If you haven't done so already and are enjoying the show, I'd encourage you to subscribe because it's a great way to learn about when a new episode is released. Feel free to come across to memoryhealthmadeeasy.com to episode 5 to grab all the great resources that we discuss and share in this episode. Also, any references to other podcasts that I think are going to be helpful and valuable to today's conversation. And no doubt you can grab our 9 principles for memory health for life, our cheat sheet that we've put together, which is a summary, how-to, quick action guide to get you moving in those areas of life, which are going to help you reduce your risk for memory loss. Because, folks, we can do something about it, and it's great for us to get in front of any memory loss issues earlier rather than later. So let's get into today's conversation with my guest, Dr. Amy Loughman.
This is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, the show where you learn practical tips and experts share advice on what you can do to boost your brain span to match your lifespan. Now to the host of the show, David Norris.
Dr. Amy Loughman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Memory Health Made Easy podcast.
It's a great pleasure, David. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, not a problem. Amy, I reached out to you through your work and your team at the Food and Mood Centre, and I'm wondering whether you could give us a bit of a brief background about the type of work that you're doing today and how you're so interested in the gut microbiome and brain access.
Sure. So I'm a research fellow at the Food and Mood Centre, and there I lead the microbiome stream of research. And we've got about 12 projects on the go that involve an investigation of the gut microbiome and how it relates to both physical and mental health, and also lifestyle factors such as diet and physical activity. And one of these is a project that I lead in collaboration with the Florey Institute's Healthy Brain Project, and that seeks to understand how the gut microbiome might be related to early signs of Alzheimer's disease risk in people who are currently healthy in their middle ages, but tracking them longer term to see how their cognitive function goes and how their disease risk goes with respect to Alzheimer's disease. So memory, function and brain disease is a real area of interest of mine.
Now, you're classically trained as a neuropsychologist, is that right?
That's right, yeah. I did my clinical neuropsychology training in Melbourne, and part of that was as a diagnostic dementia service, and also a PhD in epilepsy. So all of my training really was about kind of the biological basis of cognitive function and mood. And so that was really my interest, was the link between mind and brain. And I wanted to get at the kind of physical mental link a bit more deeply. And so I started to read about the gut microbiome, which seemed to epitomize this link incredibly well. Just the fact that the brain is, a part of the body, and it's susceptible to all of the aspects of health and disease that the body is as well. So I took a sideways step from traditional psychology research and neuropsychology to look into the gut-brain axis in a bit more detail. So I still look at the brain, but I involve the gut a lot more than I used to.
Yeah, I wouldn't be something that I come across too often, to hear of a neuropsychologist that have gone down that sort of pathway from a professional interest perspective. But it's so exciting, and I can hear
it is.
I can hear the joy and the interest in your voice as well as we speak. That obviously there's something deeper about the relationship of what happens inside our body and the relationship we have with the various different organisms, and how that plays out with our brain and our mood and how we think and how we feel. One of the key things that's probably of a concern to many folk who might listen to the podcast is trying to get a bit of a level understanding about what is okay from fluctuations in our mood and memory throughout our lifespan, and when are the warning signs of the changes that we may need to be attentive. And I thought it might be worthwhile us starting just to have a conversation around how we can normalise our perspective of memory health changes and look at maybe some of the observations and understanding about why that happens across our lifespan, and then having perhaps a point around why things tend to, what's our current understanding about why things go wrong, particularly in an experience like dementia where we see severe memory loss.
Sure, there's a lot to cover in that, and I think you're right that There is a great deal of anxiety and concern about people, particularly once they're past early adulthood. We straight away start to think about our memory and whether it's changing, particularly, I suppose, in society where we have very high expectations of ourselves all the time to perform at a high level, and through well into life and into later life, probably more than we ever have had those expectations on ourselves before, particularly when we're all in kind of cognitively demanding jobs. And likewise, mood, I think there is societally just this expectation that we are happy and that we can always be in a good state of, mental health, of course, that's the ideal. But it's important to acknowledge, as you alluded to, that there are fluctuations across the lifespan, and a lot of these are normal. They're not always signs of a particular disease. Of course, you need to be aware that if you're experiencing low mood, for example, or some other mental symptoms that are really bothering you and interfering with life, then they can be treated and they're worth investigating. But I think an important thing to remember is that it's not always a sign of dementia, particularly when we're talking about memory loss or memory changes. Something I saw a lot in the memory clinics I worked in was that failures of memory could be due to many things, such as stress, high levels of stress, and indeed depression can change the way your brain works and how clear you're thinking, and whether you remember where you put your keys and all that sort of thing. And also due to attentional lapses. So when we're under a lot of pressure, we can simply not be attending to where we put our keys, or when we're looking in the fridge and deciding what to buy at the supermarket, we may not actually be taking that information in well enough in order to remember it when we get to the supermarket. So it's not so much a failure of memory necessarily, but a failure actually of encoding. That can be due to stress and mood, for example.
When I had a conversation with a neurologist here in Brisbane, where I'm based, and he was saying, Dave, that if I would say that about 5 out of every 10 clients, I could pinpoint the major factor contributing to their presentation in my clinic. And he cites sleep as one of the big underappreciated roles of maintaining cognitive health and fitness.
Absolutely.
He cited that once we got on top of people's sleep, that they didn't need to come to the clinic. And he thought, well, why are people coming to my clinic in the first place for me to prescribe sleep? But a really interesting observation around that there are many factors contributing to our change in our cognitive performance. And you've obviously highlighted stress. Infection is another one too that can, temporarily knock us around. And sleep being another factor. And I guess this is probably a nice segue into a role of nutrition as well, and how that can play about on affecting our cognitive performance.
Look, there's a lot more evidence about nutrition and mood and mental health, to be honest, but there are starting to be studies showing that the nutritional intake throughout the lifespan does impact the way the brain works at a molecular level and also at a performance level. That's slightly less clear because people's performance is so varied, but it's clear that nutritional diet quality throughout the lifespan, and particularly in older age, does affect people's susceptibility to cognitive decline and dementia. We know that lifestyle factors, including, as you mentioned, sleep and also physical activity and stress, but certainly nutrition, are all combined together to provide a risk profile for people in terms of their brain health in older age.
Yeah, and I guess that the absence of key things are going to potentially increase a person's risk versus doing proactive, brain healthy activities of maintaining physical exercise, good sleep routine, managing our weight through midlife, looking at our mood throughout our life as well, and adequate and sufficient, beautiful nutrition is going to be one of all those key pillars to reducing our risk for memory loss later in life. And I guess that's probably where I've come to in my journey as a clinician. And my background's in occupational therapy and worked with clients that have had severe memory loss for a very long time. And my response to the situation was to try and educate people what they could do to reduce their risk for looking at that brain destiny, so to speak, and what they could be doing in a proactive way throughout their lifespan. And I guess one of the things that really startled me, and when I was looking at some of your work on your website too, Amy, was a reference around the the scale of the problem with regards to dementia globally. It's a significant problem. Over 50 million people today are diagnosed with dementia. But the treatment approach to intervening with folk that are experiencing dementia is that the drugs don't really work. That those that have some effect have a very short-term temporary effect of
and often
affecting
with significant
the
side
trajectory
effects
of
as
the
well.
disease. And it really leaves the solution or the response has moved towards a preventative focus. And I think of some of the research, say the finger study out of Finland, which looked at lifestyle components. And I understand you're also involved in a large-scale lifestyle observation research in Australia at the moment. That lifestyle intervention is where it's at. And when we look at lifestyle intervention, we've got one of the key sort of plays in all of that has been the organisms in our stomach and how what their role in all of this. So whilst we can do and put things in our body and we can expose our body to exercise and getting adequate sleep, we're also, from as I understand it, really at the having a handshake agreement with the organisms in our tummy.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is that all of the research is, even though the gut microbiome is a new field, all the research is actually coming together and converging. Those lifestyle factors that you mentioned are not standalone. They're not separate to the gut microbiome. They're all things that affect its composition and its function. So it actually makes a lot of sense that it would matter what we're eating, how we're sleeping, how stressed we are, because all of these things make up the environment that our gut microbiome resides in and has to survive and thrive and do its actions in as well. And we know that their survival and their healthy functioning is an important part of brain health.
When the term, folk would have heard the term healing starts in the gut, which is probably quite a popular term that gets thrown around, the biome, tummy bugs. But I'm hoping you could clarify, what is the microbiome?
So the microbiome, and normally we mean the gut microbiome, but there are microbiomes around many parts of the body, including the skin, the eyes, the lungs, and indeed in all parts of life, so in soil and various other parts of the natural environment. The microbiome is this collective community of microorganisms that comprises largely of bacteria, but also of fungi and archaea and other very small life forms. And so when we talk about the gut microbiome, it's approximately a kilogram of massive microorganisms living mostly in the large intestine, so the colon, but throughout the digestive tract. And it's being shown to be important in the oral cavity as well, so in the mouth and around the teeth and gums and that sort of thing.
I'd read a statistic around the number or the volume of bacteria and other organisms in our gastrointestinal system being in the order of around 200 billion. And that was a staggering number. And as it was pointed out, that's about 20 times the number of human cells or some sort of statistic. So we're certainly outnumbered in terms of the number of organisms that are there. And diversity appears to be a real key in health too, Amy. What's the current observation around the role, or what is health of the microbiome looking like? Is it around diversity? Is it about numbers? Is it about certain species? How do we understand the health of the microbiome at the moment?
That is a very hot topic, David. You've hit the nail on the head. And the short answer is we don't know. But you're right in saying that diversity seems to be important. So the studies in humans so far, often they're comparing a group of people with a particular disease and those without that particular disease. So we assume those people are, we call them healthy. Generally, what we find in adults is that the people with a certain disease, and this is the case for most diseases we look at, whether it's diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, irritable inflammatory bowel disease, or even irritable bowel syndrome, that those people with a disease have a lower diversity of their gut microbiome than the comparison healthy people. So we do think that diversity has something to do with that. And when we say diversity, we mean both the number of bacteria overall and also the type of different bacteria. So the number of different strains and species that are in there that are presumably doing lots of different things. Having said that, that's not always the case across the lifespan. So in children, for example, in very young infants, higher diversity is not necessarily a better thing. A lower diversity is associated with breastfeeding and with a vaginal delivery, and also with some better behavioral outcomes later in life. So it seems that it might change across the lifespan a bit. But in adults, we do think that diversity, which corresponds to a diverse diet as well, seems to be the best indicator for health. As for which bacteria, it really differs by disease in terms of the ones that are thought to be key players, but it's a very, very complex system. And it's really hard to say, we need more of X to be more healthy.
And that probably is a very, makes it quite challenging for some of the, in responding to people who want to be very proactive with their health. I'm seeing an interest and a lot of conversation happening around getting a stool sample and having it analysed for the composition of bacteria and other organisms. And I'm curious as to what we're going to learn individually, and also that given that there is so many variables that are going to affect composition of these different organisms in our body, it would really stand to reason that people need support and guidance from a specialist in working through what that actually means. And I'd imagine that is a very early adopter knowledge base for many clinicians out there.
Yes, and I'd argue for many researchers as well. There's, to some extent, we don't really know enough to be, for most people, for personalised approaches actually to be useful. So just to be clear, I mean, the gut microbiota is different between every person. It's a bit like a fingerprint. And I think in the future, we will get to a point where we can say, for your particular type of gut microbiome, this approach is likely to be most effective. I have hope that we'll get there, that it may be one way to do personalised medicine and personalised nutrition. The fact is that the research isn't really there yet in terms of being able to robustly recommend something like that on the basis of someone's gut microbiome. So yes, you can get your stool tested and receive a staggeringly large amount of data back about what's in your poo, a certain proportion of bugs that ferment this kind of food better than it ferments this sort of food.
Yeah.
But as to whether those sorts of insights and that sort of curiosity, I suppose, about what's inside your gut, as to whether that will change a health outcome is really unclear as yet. So while it's of great interest to me, I haven't, for example, sent my stool off to get a response, because even me, and I look at this data quite a bit, I wouldn't know quite what to make of it and therefore how to change my lifestyle. But
yeah, so it comes back to full circle almost on key principles of following a diet which is rich in diversity.
Yep.
Whole foods, less processed food.
That's the thing. The best information we have at hand is to support our brain health and our gut microbiome is to follow dietary guidelines. The Australian dietary guidelines are perfect. They're available readily online, but most governments have them, and they tend to be evidence-based. They get updated every few years based on nutrition research. And as you say, it's plenty of fresh fruit and vegetables, whole grain, lean animal proteins, limited processed foods and snack foods. It's pretty simple, boring stuff, but actually it is the best evidence we've got.
Yeah, and no doubt the safest pathway for many folk to follow as well.
Mm-hmm.
Amy, there's a term that I've come across in the literature, and I'm hoping you might be able to talk a little bit more about it. And the term is around psychobiotics. And as I understand the role of psychobiotics is that we've now understood that there are certain organisms or certain species that have a role in contributing to our neurological performance and cognitive health. And that has reaching effects from affecting our memory through to our mood. I'm wondering if you could add anything around the role of psychobiotics and what we understand around psychobiotics as well.
So what we mean by psychobiotics is a gut-directed therapy that aims to target the brain in some sort of positive way. So we normally mean either a probiotic, which is a live organism or a bacteria that we take in order to add to the sort of community that we've already got down there, or a prebiotic, which is usually a type of fiber that feeds the bacteria or the probiotic, or a symbiotic, which is a combination of the two. We could also argue, though, that diet is a kind of psychobiotic if used properly. So it's something that we take that affects the gut, but actually also affects the brain, and that's the idea of it. Now, the realm of psychobiotics, it's very new. It was a term coined in 2012, I think, by some Irish gurus of the gut-brain field. And there has been mounting evidence in animals that you can take certain types of gut-directed probiotics, prebiotics, or symbiotics that change brain function in animals. And that might be in terms of certain neurotransmitters, that might be the structure and function of particular brain tissues, or indeed behavior, as you mentioned. So there are animal studies showing improved or changes to behavior, anxiety-like symptoms, and the like. I suppose also you could consider fecal microbiota transplant for brain function to be a psychobiotic as well, by the way. In humans, there is much less evidence in terms of which particular strains affect what kinds of outcomes. And I think although we can see a couple of probiotics having changes to the brain in human subjects, I think it's less likely to be about a single organism that has one effect, and more about what that does to the entire community of organisms down there, which makes it really tricky in terms of recommending a particular probiotic or even a particular prebiotic, because the probiotic we take might have 1,000 units of a particular strain, but if that doesn't integrate with the community of bacteria that's already down there and improve the collective efforts towards your health of that whole community, then it will be entirely useless.
That's sort of expensive exercise, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it is.
I when looking at some of that research around psychobiotics, and I can see that we, no doubt have a population of evidence and information with mice, but very few studies with humans. And I noticed one randomized control trial that used psychobiotics with clients with Alzheimer's type dementia, and they observed on their measures an increase in performance on a cognitive assessment, reduced inflammatory markers, and improved or reduced insulin resistance, which is kind of promising. But on the other hand, a similar study showed very little benefit. So there's and the pool of information appears to be still relatively small in terms of guiding our understanding for such a complex issue or complex relationship in our tummy. And as I understand it, the organisms, the bacteria, are quite promiscuous. They like sharing things. They like exchanging bits and pieces with each other, and viruses, and grabbing things. So it's quite a dynamic relationship at any given moment. And what's the current view of things that promote health across the lifespan of our microbiome, given that there is such interplay between organisms, given our consumption of antibiotics, particularly when we're needing to treat an infection, given we might be exposed to a seasonal influenza outbreak? What's the current thinking at the moment to maintain the robustness of our microbiome?
It's really the same things that we use to take care of our physical health more generally. Diet is considered the most important influence on the gut microbiome, in concert with antibiotics, because they target bacteria specifically. But even after antibiotics, the gut bacteria does bounce back in terms of replenishing itself, as long as it has adequate fuel to do so. And the fuel is really diet, because what happens is that food that's ingested that isn't metabolized by the stomach and the small intestine travels down into the large intestine for further processing. And the things that survive down to there are dietary fibers and prebiotic fibers, resistant starches. And those food components feed bacteria, particularly the bacteria that are healthful to our body's normal functioning. So that's why diet's really important. When you're feeding yourself, you're really feeding your bugs as well, and feeding it the kinds of bacteria the kinds of fiber that will allow it to thrive, allows it to replenish itself after the kinds of hits that you mentioned, whether it be an infection or an antibiotic that you need to take, or a very stressful time at work, or whatever it is. The other thing to mention is that there are aspects of our modern food environment that are noxious to gut microbiome that really would be helpful to avoid. And these are things that probably people would think are not particularly healthy anyway for the body, and that's quite true. And part of the reason for that might be because of their effect on the gut microbiome. So that includes things like artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, the kinds of preservatives that hold very processed food together, that keep a long shelf life. These can all be avoided relatively easily by just aiming for food that's pretty close to its original form, or that you can make at home. It doesn't need to be fancy, but basically the less that the food has gone through before it reaches you, the better, because some of those food additives have been shown to have negative impacts on the gut microbiome and also the lining of the gut, which is important for maintaining a low, to not exacerbate an immune response, which can be mounted when the gut is inflamed and when the gut lining is not doing its job properly, to keep things in the gut within the gut rather than letting them circulate throughout the bloodstream and the body.
With the role that the observation around psychobiotics and how it influences our mood and memory and the relationship of obviously food, how does that communication happen from our tummy, from our stomach, from our intestine, small intestine, large intestine? How is that communication occurring? What's the observation around how the bugs, what for general layperson would be, well, how does bacteria actually communicate to my brain and affect these changes?
Yeah, there are lots of ways that this happens. One of them, and they all seem to be happening at the same time. One of them is through the vagus nerve, which connects the brain to almost all the organs in the body, including the gut. And it's clear that the bacteria have some communication pathways with the vagus nerve and vice versa, so up to the brain and down from the brain, which is part of the important communication to the brain of, the state that the body's in and whether the brain needs to mount any kind of response in response to how the organs and the body are going. So that's one of them, is the vagus nerve. Bacteria also produce small byproducts when they metabolize food. Some of these are called short-chain fatty acids, and they can signal directly to the brain and also signal to cells around the body about the state of the gut. And they're also involved in keeping that intestinal membrane intact. So if there aren't enough of these, then bugs can actually start to need to eat away the cell wall of the lining of the gut. And that signals to the brain via the circulating bloodstream that there's some inflammation around the body because there's an immune problem where there's the lining that's supposed to keep food and bacteria in the gut is actually compromised and starts to sort of leak little immune markers and inflammatory markers out into the rest of the body to signal there's a problem. And that information gets transmitted to the brain and can be part of an inflammatory response in the brain as well, which is not good. We see increasing inflammation across the lifespan, just as we tend to get more inflammation across aging, but it is related to health and lifestyle, and we can mitigate it to some degree by keeping our health in check.
I've noted that inflammatory response can also affect the blood-brain barrier and its permeability.
Absolutely, yeah. And permeability is seen in Alzheimer's disease and other neurological diseases.
And with looking at that presentation of Alzheimer's disease, and I noticed Parkinson's disease also as part of those neurological conditions. MS, I believe, are also in that sort of observation around the role of the gut microbiome and the brain pathology. Wondered, around that relationship of what's starting to be understood around maybe a mechanistic observation of how the gut influences disease process, particularly around Alzheimer's type dementia.
It's really tricky. So it's a combination of those kinds of factors that I mentioned before. The inflammatory response seems to be part of it as well. And bacteria seem to be involved in the accumulation of amyloid beta protein, which accumulate in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So it happens naturally across the lifespan, but it's in much higher proportion in people who have Alzheimer's disease. That's been seen in post-mortem studies afterwards. And there are a few things that tell us that bacteria are involved in this process. And one of them is that germ-free mice that have been bred to have a genetic predisposition to having Alzheimer's disease, so they've been genetically modified, are actually less likely to get the disease if they're raised in a germ-free environment. So that means without any exposure to the normal bacteria of life. Of course, we can't replicate that, but it does give us a hint that bacteria are interacting with a genetic or environmental vulnerability to a disease and being part of that process. It's not to say that bacteria are bad necessarily, but it gives us a clue as to the way that they're being involved. We also see that and this is a little bit controversial because there are some questions about contamination, but we have seen, or other studies have seen, that in the brain tissue of people who've died with Alzheimer's disease, there are bacteria present in quite high levels that correspond to bacteria in the mouth, which again suggests that it's not just the gut bacteria, it might be the oral cavity as well. That's really important. And how they're getting there, I mean, who knows? That's still really an open question.
Yeah. Digestion does start in the mouth, doesn't it? Or even before the mouth, from
it
smell.
Does, and the mouth's quite a lot closer to the brain than the gut is.
Yeah. I end the point around the mice that are developed with a genetic risk factor to predispose them to experiencing dementia. The same, listening to that point, the same things that were going off in my head was around the role of APOE4 and those folk that have that genetic variant, and maybe from mum and dad, increasing their lifetime risk for dementia compared to someone who doesn't have that genetic factor. As I understand, that particular gene is responsible for longevity and has been associated with a very good immune system response to helping, from an evolutionary perspective, helping folk manage infection early, and had a survival mechanism of managing those infection risks as we evolved as a species. But it's been a gene that the current thinking is that it comes back to haunt us later in life from its mechanism. And I wonder around, has there been any observation around the role of the gut microbiomes and interaction within folk that have got that genetic variation?
It's something that we're looking at in the Healthy Brain Project study. They are looking at people with and without an increased genetic risk, and I'll be comparing the gut microbiome of those two groups and looking at whether there is some sort of interaction, whether there's an increased vulnerability to a gut microbiome change, for example, in those with genetic risk, or indeed if there's a protection, like you mentioned. It's an active area of research, so stay tuned.
Okay. What's exciting you at the moment, Amy, with regards to the field of research and stuff that you're doing?
Oh, so much. Where to start? I keep coming back to it, but I think actually the oral microbiome is my current area of fascination. I think it's really exciting as well because it's easier to get a saliva swab than a stool sample from most people. It's very accessible in terms of if we find that improving oral health can have an impact on brain health, and it's very easy to make those recommendations. Probably easier than diet change is to say, look, if you floss twice a day, then these are the kind of improvements you can expect, or this is the sort of preventative effect it might have. Preventative dental care as well could be rolled out and made more accessible if we had good evidence there. And I think that's something that the evidence is mounting for, the state of your mouth being really important for the state of your brain. And again, it kind of demystifies brain health because it is really quite scary when we think about cognitive decline. And I think there's a sense that, well, how the brain's so complex, how could we possibly do anything to improve its health? I think there's a lot of helplessness around that. And knowing that lifestyle factors, including just your oral hygiene, knowing that you can make a difference from things that you do day to day, I think is really encouraging and provides us a lot of scope for preventative work. So that's kind of where I'm focusing my efforts, but certainly diet has a lot to do with the oral cavity as well as the gut microbiome, and they're in interplay. So it's certainly not one or the other, but if I had to choose one thing, that might be the one right now.
It's interesting, isn't it? That it is such a complex organ, and it's obviously got such a rich network of relationships that it relies on for its performance. But what we're seeing through your work and others as well is that whilst it is very complex, what we can do is move to a position of of taking some very simple actions that are going to affect a change in that complexity, or affect a change in how the network is working. And
Absolutely. Even simple things can have complex outcomes. You're quite right.
yeah, and that fascinates me. That's what intrigues me. And trying to make it a simple message for folk to
Mm.
grasp and apply in a way that is going to help move the needle in a positive direction for brain health. I remember the great open online course run by the Wicking group down in Tasmania. They have
Mhm.
a slide or a video in their presentation around preventing dementia, which if folk haven't done or accessed that course, it's a fantastic course, where they've got a picture of a Lego group in a line. Imagine all these figurines, these Lego guys.
Mm.
And from one end, it represents a person that has very high risk factors. Maybe they've got a number of diseases that they've got, or family history, and they've got a genetic risk factor. And so they've got a higher risk of experiencing dementia in their lifetime versus somebody at the other end of the spectrum who has no genetic exposures, no family history, and a very following a brain health type lifestyle.
Mhm.
And what was really interesting is that through this conversation of taking simple actions, particularly with the group that were at high risk, were able to move their risk profile down that sort of continuum line, and not able to get maybe right to the very end, but certainly move it down. And they're the things that I think are really important messages that folk need to hear, is that the things that we can do are going to
Mhm.
add up over time. And it's that repetitive small hinges are going to make a big difference if we keep at it. And
Yeah.
I'm really excited to hear and follow what's going to happen with your work, particularly around the oral biome there as well.
Mm. Yeah.
Tell me about the Healthy Brain project that you're involved with, and what are you guys investigating there?
So the Healthy Brain Project is being run out of the Florey Institute, and it's still recruiting, by the way, for people in Melbourne who might be interested in knowing a bit more about their brain health and taking part in an annual survey. It seeks to understand the lifestyle and biomarkers that relate to a risk of Alzheimer's disease in healthy middle age. So as you mentioned before, it seems really that we need to be moving toward prevention for Alzheimer's disease, because thus far treatments haven't been that effective. And so we're looking earlier and earlier in life to see whether we can identify the kinds of factors that are important for increasing or decreasing risk, and whether those can be translated into a public health message, I suppose. And I'm specifically looking at the gut and the oral microbiome part of that to see whether, firstly, if there are differences in those microbial communities in people with and without a genetic risk, how that relates to their cognitive function and their change in cognitive function over time. And also we're looking at detailed biomarkers that might give us an insight into how the brain is changing well before symptoms emerge, and they may never emerge, but changes that occur in middle life that we know can be indicative of a risk of Alzheimer's disease. So these include changes visible on an MRI, and also small molecule changes in the cerebrospinal fluid as well, looking at the accumulation of amyloid beta and tau. So I'll be looking at how the gut microbiome plays into all of that, and also how it relates to diet and other lifestyle factors, to see whether we can identify some evidence about the best preventative strategies that impact the gut microbiome and the brain.
So is this a randomized controlled trial of
No,
implementing?
it's an observational study. Yeah, so people are self-participating. They can just do so on the website, healthybrainproject.org.au, but I'll confirm that and you can put it on your show
Yeah,
notes
I'll
if
put that
that's
in
of
the show
interest.
notes for sure. Yeah.
And yeah, so we're just observing how they go and their cognitive function over time, and as it relates to their lifestyle factors and their Alzheimer's disease or potential Alzheimer's disease biomarkers in their microbiome.
So how long is the observation going to go for again, Amy?
It'll go for as long as possible. I believe it's currently funded for 5 years, but of course it's important to track these people over a longer time, because it's likely that at 5 years people will still be quite healthy. But we're looking for subtle changes. So by following people up every year, we'll be able to see slowly how things change and when the best points for intervention might be.
With an observational study like this, do you expect that folk that do enrol in this type of activity are going to be curiously investigating what they can do for their brain health anyway? And would there be a positive association that they're actually making behaviour changes throughout the course of the observation?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And we find that when it's not a random sample of people, then they do tend to be motivated and interested and able to participate and already quite active, for sure. But I think even across that, in that sample of people who are motivated, we will be able to see differences across lifestyles and across their genetic risk and their microbiome, that sort of thing. I think there are several thousand people being recruited for this study in Melbourne, and a couple of hundred of those will participate in the gut microbiome part. And I think in those numbers, we can still see some variability around disease risk and their lifestyle.
If you had any resources out there that you might recommend to folk that, they're on a journey, making some questions about what they can do to reduce their risk for memory loss and what they can do to improve, I guess, their brain health on a day-to-day basis, what would you suggest as being a good place or good resource to start with, Amy?
I think in terms of understanding memory, there's a fantastic book that the name has just escaped me. I did mention it to you before.
Memory-wise, was that right?
Memory-wise, that's the one, yeah.
By Dr. Anne Stein?
Unkenstein, that's right. She practices in memory clinics in Melbourne. And that's wonderful for just normalising the variability of memory across the lifespan and in older age, and when to worry and when not to worry, that sort of thing. So that's a really useful starting point. In terms of understanding a bit more about the gut microbiome and how that relates to both mental health and brain health and health more generally, there's a great website called Gut Microbiota for Health, which I can also send you the exact URL for, which translates or simplifies the current scientific studies into very readable short articles, and basically gives you a sense of whether there's anything you should do to change your lifestyle in response to this study, or whether it's just kind of a interesting scientific study. It's www.gutmicrobiota4health. So those are a couple of resources. And then more generally, I think the dietary guidelines one is one that I'd really encourage people to just have another look at, because we do forget, amongst all of the information we get about what a healthy diet is, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and like there's the advice changes all the time, and we're not sure if coffee's good for us or if it's bad for us, or should we be eating more dairy or less dairy. And I think it's useful sometimes just to come back to basics, and those Australian guidelines that are evidence-based are accessible at eatforhealth.gov.au. And something I'll just highlight there is that fibre is really important. Almost all Australians are not getting enough fibre, and this is massively important for the gut microbiome and therefore for brain health as well. We're recommended to get 25 to 30 grams a day of fibre, which is tricky to achieve without really loading your plate with lots of vegetables. So I recommend people go onto there and just be reminded about what the guidelines are. I think if we got most people onto following those most of the time, we'd go a really long way to improving all of our health.
Oh, Amy, thank you very much for offering those. We'll put them in the show notes on our website at Memory Health Made Easy.
You're welcome.
And Amy, if they were to follow your work, you've also got a website as well.
I do. It's mindbodymicrobiome.com.
Okay, and there's I know that I've got a good education from your website as well.
Excellent.
Dr. Amy Loughman, thank you very much for your time today. It is greatly appreciated. I've learned a lot in reading your work and others around the role of the microbiome in regards to our brain health, and also looking what we can do through very simple actions to reduce our risk for memory loss in our lifespan. And key to understanding that is appreciating that exercise, sleep, stress, and importantly, food, what we eat, is going to have a significant impact on our helpful little organisms in our body. Now, I flicked back through my notes here, and I know that I quoted earlier in our conversation of around 200 billion. Now, I've got that figure completely wrong. It's the power of 14 microorganisms, which is
a few more zeros.
100 times our cells of our body. So we need to take care of those guys as much as possible, and it really starting to get very clear that it confers a positive outcome for our brain and cognitive fitness should we start to acknowledge that these simple actions are going to have a payoff for our bugs and our body. Dr. Amy Loughman, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks for a great conversation, David.
Oh, you're welcome. Ta.
Well, what a fantastic conversation. And I do want to put a big apologies up to folk that have listened to it, that it came across a little bit boomy from my side. And that's because as I dive into podcasting, sometimes you get the audio a little bit messed up. But what a wonderful conversation. In it, we've covered off how does your gut communicate, and particularly the organisms, communicate to your brain? How is the microbiome involved in our brain health? Why food quality matters. And we dived into some of those key hallmarks of what quality food is. And we spoke about whole food and what to watch for when we're reaching for things on the shelf. How to keep the harmony, the balance, the health of our tummy organisms. And we spoke in some detail about what's required there. And ultimately, we spoke about why food is associated with increasing our risk for cognitive decline and putting us at risk for conditions like Alzheimer's disease when we're older by the choices we make throughout our life. And remember, folks, as we mentioned in the show today, there is no cure for conditions like Alzheimer's, and prevention is where it's at. So this podcast, this episode today goes to the heart of that, about what you can do to reduce your risk for avoidable memory loss. I'm David Norris, and I'm the host of the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, and I want to thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe if you haven't done so already, and give us a bit of a rating about what your thoughts are about the show. If you'd like the show, share it amongst your friends. Even share the content of what you've learnt today with others, as this will help you reinforce what you've learned. And it goes some way to helping me and what we're on about here at Memory Health Made Easy, and that is to reach more and serve more people to help them reduce their risk for avoidable memory loss. Again, thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, David Norris of Memory Health Made Easy podcast. Bye for now.